I didn't want to stay in the cabin. That was my first mistake. But when you're tired, miles away from home, and there's a roof over your head, you don't argue with convenience. The place was small, old, and smelled like damp wood and dust. It had been sitting in the middle of nowhere, just off a winding road that barely looked used. The trees swallowed it, towering, thick, blocking out most of the fading sunlight. I had been driving for hours. The plan was simple, just me, the road, and the silence for a few days. But somewhere along the way, I took a wrong turn, and my GPS gave up. No signal, no clue where I was. Then the car started sputtering. I had half a tank, but the engine wouldn't start back up after I pulled over to check the map. And there it was, the cabin. There were no signs, no mailbox, nothing to indicate who owned it. But the door was unlocked, and the windows weren't broken. That was enough for me. I told myself I'd rest for the night and figure things out in the morning. Inside, it was just as empty as I expected. A small kitchen, a sagging couch, a table with mismatched chairs, a single bedroom with a thin mattress on a wooden frame. No pictures, no decorations, no sign of life. I wasn't comfortable, but exhaustion overpowered hesitation. I locked the door, checked the windows, and stretched out on the mattress. That's when I noticed the scratches. They were carved into the walls, deep, jagged. Not words, not drawings, just long, uneven slashes running in all directions. Some looked fresh, others had faded into the wood over time. I told myself it was nothing. Probably some animals got in, maybe kids messing around. It didn't matter. Then I found the knife. It was under the bed, lying on the floor, half covered in dust. A long hunting knife, dull but still sharp enough to cut. I picked it up, turned it over in my hands. The handle was worn, the blade stained with something dark. A bad feeling settled in my stomach. I told myself I was being paranoid. I should have left then, should have grabbed my bag and walked until I found a road that actually led somewhere. But it was dark, and I didn't know where I was. I stayed. I slept lightly, waking up every hour. The wind howled through the trees, branches scraping against the walls. The silence in between was worse. Too quiet. No crickets, no animals, just nothing. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, I heard it. A soft creaking, like weight shifting on old wooden floors. I didn't move. I held my breath. Listened. Nothing. I sat up slowly, the mattress groaning under me. The room was pitch black, but I could feel it. Something was different. The air was heavier, the silence deeper. I gripped the knife, listened. Then, another sound. Closer. A shuffle. Something dragging. I turned on my flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, landing on the door. Closed. The handle hadn't moved. But I knew, deep in my bones, that I wasn't alone. I stood up, heart pounding. Every nerve screamed at me to run. But where? Into the woods? I had no idea what was out there. I checked the window, just trees, nothing else. But I felt watched. The kind of feeling that makes your skin crawl, makes your instincts scream that something is wrong. I needed to leave. Now, I grabbed my bag, the knife still in my grip. I reached for the door, and then the handle moved. Slow, deliberate. Someone on the other side. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The door didn't open. The handle just turned back and forth, like whoever was out there was testing it, playing with it. I took a step back, then another. Silence. Then a single knock. Soft, almost polite. I swallowed hard, forced myself to breathe. I didn't answer. Then another knock. Louder. My hands shook. I clenched the knife tighter. Then a voice. Low, quiet, almost a whisper. Open up. No emotion, no urgency. Just a statement, like they knew I would. I didn't move, didn't speak, just waited. Then the voice again. I know you're in there. I backed away, my legs shaking. I wasn't going to open the door. Then the knocking stopped. I waited. The silence stretched. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I wasn't sure. Then, slowly, I crept to the window. I held my breath and peeked outside. Nothing, just darkness, trees, stillness. And then I saw them. Not close, just standing at the tree line, a shadow in the dark, barely visible. But they were there, watching. I didn't move, didn't blink, just stared back. They didn't come closer, didn't move at all, just stood there. I backed away, heart hammering. I had to leave. Now, I grabbed my bag, shoved the knife inside, and made my way to the back door. I turned the knob slowly, easing it open. The night air was cold, heavy. I stepped outside. Silence. I forced myself to move. One step, then another, toward the trees, away from the cabin. I didn't look back. I walked for hours. The fear kept me going. By dawn, I found a road, an actual road. Car passed. I waved it down. The driver was hesitant but let me in. I didn't tell them what happened. I just told them to drive. I never looked back, never went near that place again, and I never found out who or what was waiting in that cabin. I had been looking forward to the trip for months. A week alone in a remote cabin, away from the noise of the city, away from people, away from everything. It was supposed to be peaceful, a chance to clear my head. I needed the break, needed the silence. I had no idea how quickly silence could turn into something else, something I would never forget. The drive up was long, almost 5 hours of winding roads and thick trees stretching endlessly on both sides. The last 30 minutes were on a dirt road. No signs, no streetlights, nothing but the forest closing in tighter the further I went. My cell service had died about an hour ago, but that was expected. The cabin's owner had warned me about it when I booked the place. "If you need anything, you'll have to drive back toward town," he had said. I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured I wouldn't need anything. The cabin itself was exactly how it had been described. Small but sturdy, with a wraparound porch and a woodpile stacked neatly against one side. Inside, it smelled like old wood and dust. There was a fireplace, a small kitchen, a bedroom with a single window, and a bathroom that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. But it had running water, a working stove, and a thick lock on the door. That was all I needed. The first day was uneventful. I unpacked my bags, stacked firewood inside for the night, and sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the trees. The quiet was nice. No cars, no voices, just the occasional creak of the trees in the wind. I went to bed early, the darkness outside thicker than I was used to, but I slept fine. The second day, things started to feel different. I woke up to a sound I couldn't place. Not an animal, not the wind, something else. Something small, deliberate, like someone moving outside. I sat up in bed, listening. It was still early, the sun barely up, but the sound was gone. Probably just the trees settling, I told myself. I went outside, checked around the cabin. Nothing. No tracks, no signs that anyone had been there. Still, the uneasy feeling stuck with me. Later that afternoon, I went for a walk. I didn't stray far, just enough to stretch my legs. The forest was dense, quiet in a way that felt unnatural. No birds, no rustling in the underbrush. Just me and the sound of my own footsteps. After about 15 minutes, I turned back. That's when I saw it. A footprint, not mine. Fresh, in the dirt, leading toward my cabin. I froze. It was a boot print, large, deep. Someone had been there. Recently. I scanned the trees, my heart pounding. I couldn't see anyone, couldn't hear anything, but I wasn't alone. I walked back as fast as I could without running, my ears straining for any sound, any movement. When I got to the cabin, I locked the door behind me. I checked the windows, making sure they were all closed. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. That night, I kept the fire burning. Every sound outside made me jump. I barely slept. On the third day, I found more tracks. Not just one set, two, and they were closer to the cabin. Someone had walked around it, stopping at the windows. That was it. I grabbed my keys, packed my bag, and got in my car. I turned the key. Nothing. Dead. Panic started to creep in. I checked under the hood. I wasn't a mechanic, but the engine looked fine. The battery should have been good. I had checked it before I left. Someone had done this. I had no choice. I was stuck. The nearest town was miles away. I locked myself inside the cabin, pushing furniture against the door. I had food, water. I could wait until morning, then start walking. That night was the longest of my life. At some point, I must have dozed off because a sound snapped me awake. It was inside the cabin. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the kitchen. I had locked the door. I had blocked it, but someone was inside. My mind raced. The only way in was the windows. I had checked them. Hadn't I? I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed it at the kitchen. The door was open, wide open. The fire was low, just embers, but I could see enough. Nothing there. No one. Then, another sound. From the bedroom. I ran. Out the front door, into the cold, into the dark. My flashlight beam cut through the trees as I stumbled away from the cabin. I didn't stop. Didn't look back. I don't know how far I ran before I saw the lights. Headlights. A truck, parked on the dirt road. A man stood next to it, staring at me. I didn't care who he was. I ran straight to him. He didn't say a word, just opened the truck door. Climbed in. He got in after me, turned the key, and we drove. I didn't look back at the cabin. I never went back. Later, after I got home, after I calmed down enough to think, I looked up the property. The cabin had been abandoned for years. The man who rented it to me didn't exist. I never wanted to be out here alone, but I had no choice. The cabin belonged to my uncle, and after he passed, it was left to me. I didn't even know the man well. Met him maybe twice in my life, but his lawyer called, said I was the only living relative, and now this cabin was mine. I should have just sold it, but something about it pulled me in. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was just the fact that I had nowhere else to go. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun already sinking behind the trees. The cabin was deep in the woods, far from any town, and the road leading here was nothing but dirt and gravel. My truck barely made it, the tires spinning in the loose earth, the engine groaning on the steep inclines. When I finally saw the place, I almost laughed. It was smaller than I expected. A one-story thing with a sagging roof and a porch that looked ready to collapse. The wood was dark with age, the windows streaked with grime. I could see the chimney, bricks crumbling, and the front door hung slightly crooked in its frame. Inside, it was worse. Dust covered everything. The air was stale, thick with the smell of rot and old wood. There was a small living room with a stone fireplace, a tiny kitchen with a rusted-out sink, and a single bedroom with a bed that looked like it hadn't been slept in for years. The place felt abandoned, like no one had set foot inside for a long time. I dropped my bag by the door and started looking around. There were old books on a shelf, their pages yellowed and curling. A cabinet full of mismatched dishes, all coated in a layer of dust. The fridge was empty, of course, but I had brought enough food to last me a week. That was the plan. Stay here for a week, clean up the place, decide if I wanted to keep it or not. By the time I finished unloading my truck, it was almost dark. I lit a couple of old oil lamps I found in the bedroom since the power wasn't working. I sat on the old couch, listening to the sounds outside. The wind through the trees, the occasional creak of the cabin settling. It was quiet, too quiet. That first night, I didn't sleep well. The bed was uncomfortable, the blankets musty, but it was more than that. I kept waking up, convinced I had heard something. A soft scrape against the floor, a shuffle outside the window. Every time I sat up, the room was empty. Just my imagination, I told myself. The second day, I started cleaning. I wiped down the counters, swept the floor, aired out the blankets. It made the place feel a little less abandoned, but I still couldn't shake the unease. That afternoon, I went outside to chop some firewood. That's when I found something strange. Behind the cabin, hidden among the trees, was a trapdoor. It was old, the wood warped and gray, half buried under leaves and dirt. I almost didn't see it. There was no handle, just a small metal ring. I pulled it, and the door groaned open, revealing a dark hole with a ladder leading down. I hesitated. Something about it didn't feel right. Why would a cabin like this have a basement? But curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed down. The air was damp and cold. The basement wasn't big, just a dirt floor, stone walls, and a few wooden shelves. It was empty except for an old wooden chest shoved into the corner. It looked ancient, the wood dark and splintered, the metal hinges rusted. I knelt beside it, ran my fingers over the lid. No lock. I opened it. Inside were bones. Not animal bones, human. A skull sat at the top, empty eye sockets staring up at me. Ribs, leg bones, a spine, all piled together. Some still had scraps of fabric clinging to them, rotted and stained dark. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. This wasn't right. This was something out of a nightmare. I scrambled up the ladder and slammed the trapdoor shut. My heart was pounding. My hands were shaking. I needed to leave. Right then and there, I needed to pack my things and get out of this place. But I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe it was shock. Maybe it was some twisted need to understand what I had just found. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me jump. The wind against the window, the creak of the old wood. I kept thinking about the bones. Who did they belong to? How long had they been down there? And why the hell had my uncle never mentioned this? The next morning, I made up my mind. I was leaving. I stuffed my things into my bag, grabbed my keys, and stepped outside. My truck was dead. The battery was fine. The gas tank was full. But the engine wouldn't turn over. It didn't make sense. I checked everything I knew how to check, but nothing worked. It was like something had just decided the truck wasn't going to run. I was stuck. I spent the rest of the day trying to fix it, but nothing helped. By the time the sun started to set, I was exhausted. I went inside, locked the door, and sat in front of the fireplace, trying to think. I could hike out, but the nearest town was miles away. I had food and water. Maybe I could wait it out. Then I heard it, a sound from beneath the floorboards, a slow scraping noise. My stomach turned to ice. I held my breath, listening. The scraping stopped. Then something knocked. A slow, deliberate knock. 3 times. My hands were shaking. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, an old fireplace poker, and stood there, staring at the floor. The knock came again. I took a step back. Then another. Then the trapdoor creaked. I ran. I didn't stop. I didn't think. I just ran. Out the door, into the woods, crashing through the underbrush. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. The cold air burned my lungs. Branches scratched my face, tore at my clothes. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay. I ran until my legs gave out, until I collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath. The woods were silent around me. No wind, no animals, just silence. Then, in the distance, I heard it. 3 knocks. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know what was under that trapdoor. I don't want to know. I made it to a road the next day, flagged down a trucker, and never looked back. The cabin is still out there. Someone else might find it. Someone else might open that trapdoor. But it won't be me. I don't know why I agreed to stay in that cabin. Maybe it was the price, dirt cheap for a week in the middle of nowhere. Maybe it was the idea of disconnecting. No service, no emails, just me and my thoughts. Or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't scared of being alone in the woods. I packed light, just some clothes, a flashlight, a few cans of food, and a hunting knife I kept more for comfort than necessity. The drive up was long, the roads narrowing as the trees thickened. The last few miles were on a dirt path, the kind that makes you nervous about getting stuck if it rained. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already starting to dip behind the trees. The cabin was small but sturdy looking. Just 1 floor, wooden walls darkened by time, and a roof that sagged a little in the middle. The front door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale. Dust floated in the fading light. A single room made up most of the cabin. An old wooden table with 2 chairs, a tiny kitchen area with an outdated gas stove, and a narrow bed against the wall. There was a small bathroom in the back, barely more than a closet with a rust-stained sink and a toilet that took a few stubborn flushes to work. I walked around, getting familiar with the place. The windows had thick curtains that looked like they hadn't been moved in years. A fireplace sat unused in one corner, stacked with old logs that smelled of damp rot. There was no electricity, just an old lantern sitting on the table. It was exactly what I had expected: basic, quiet, isolated. The first night was fine. I made a fire, heated a can of beans, and ate in silence. Outside, the forest was alive with sounds. Crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, rustling in the underbrush. I reminded myself it was just animals, nothing to be afraid of. Still, I locked the door before I went to bed, just in case. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound. A thud, somewhere outside. I lay still, listening. The crickets had gone silent. The only sound was my own breathing. Another thud, closer this time. I sat up, heart pounding. It sounded like something, or someone, was walking around the cabin. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, but the weak beam only illuminated a small patch of the room. I stayed still, gripping my knife, listening. Silence. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer. I forced myself to lie back down, but sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, I stepped outside and circled the cabin. The ground was soft from recent rain, but there were no footprints, just scattered leaves and twigs. Maybe I had imagined it. The second night, I was more on edge. I sat by the fire longer than necessary, listening to the woods. Around midnight, I heard it again. This time, it was lighter, like something brushing against the cabin walls. I turned off my lantern, hoping to see movement outside. But in the dark, the windows reflected only my own face. Then came the sound of breathing. Slow, deep, just outside the window. I froze. My own breathing hitched in my throat. I forced myself to move, gripping my knife as I stepped toward the window. With one quick motion, I pulled the curtain aside and shined my flashlight outside. Nothing. The forest stared back at me, empty and still. I barely slept that night. By the third day, I was exhausted. I spent the daylight hours gathering wood, keeping busy, anything to shake the feeling that I was being watched. When night came, I didn't bother with a fire. I locked the door, wedged a chair under the handle, and sat at the table with my knife and flashlight, waiting. The noise came later this time, a soft scraping along the wall. Slow, purposeful. I held my breath. Then footsteps, moving around the cabin. One slow step after another. Something was out there. I was sure of it. The footsteps stopped at the front door. I gripped my knife so tight my hand ached. I wanted to move, to do something, but fear kept me frozen in place. A long moment of silence. Then, the doorknob turned. It rattled once, twice. The chair held. The door didn't open. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. No footsteps walking away. No sound of retreating movement. Just silence. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping my knife, waiting. When the first light crept through the window, I finally moved. My hands were shaking as I unblocked the door and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the forest quiet. Then I saw them. Footprints. Not animal tracks. Human. Leading from the edge of the woods to my front door. But there were no prints leading away. I didn't go out to the cabin for fun. It wasn't some weekend getaway, some escape from life. I went because I had nowhere else to go. My uncle left it to me when he passed. I barely knew him. The last time I saw him, I was 12, and even then, he hardly spoke to me. He was one of those old men who lived alone for so long that he just became part of the silence around him. I didn't know if he liked me or hated me, but for some reason, in his will, he left me the cabin. Not my father, not my cousins, just me. I didn't think much of it when I got the letter. I was too busy losing my apartment, losing my job, losing every little piece of my life that mattered. I had debts and no way to pay them. So when I read that letter, all I saw was a place I could go that wouldn't cost me anything. A place away from the calls and the notices and the weight pressing down on my chest every time I opened my eyes. The cabin was way up north, passed the last little town on the map, deep into the woods where the roads turned to dirt and the trees blocked out the sky. By the time I pulled up to it, my car was coughing smoke, and my gas light had been on for miles. It wasn't much, a one-room structure with a metal roof and a porch that sagged in the middle. It had a wood stove, a single cot, and shelves filled with old cans of food. It smelled like dust, like something left behind. There was no electricity, no running water. Just an outhouse out back and a rusted hand pump that spat out brownish water when I worked the handle. It was cold, but I had blankets. The air was heavy with the smell of pine and wet earth. There was nothing around for miles, just the trees and the silence. That first night, I sat on the porch and listened to the woods. It was quiet in a way I wasn't used to. No hum of cars, no voices, no music spilling from someone's window. Just the wind through the trees and the distant hoot of an owl. It should have been peaceful, but it wasn't. Felt too empty, too still. The first thing that unsettled me was the feeling that someone had been there before me. Not my uncle. I knew he hadn't been out here in years. But when I looked around the cabin, I found little things that didn't seem right. A knife on the counter with dried food on the blade. A half-burned log in the stove like someone had just put it out. A bundle of blankets in the corner, folded like a bed, had been made there. Things that wouldn't be here if no one had been inside for years. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the lawyer had sent someone to check on the place before I got there. Maybe an animal had knocked something over. I locked the door that night, not that the thin wooden frame would keep anything out. The next day, I went to gather firewood. The trees were thick, the ground covered in dead leaves. It was colder than I expected for October. As I walked, I kept thinking I heard something behind me. A twig snapping, leaves crunching. But every time I turned, there was nothing. Just the trees, just the quiet. Then I found the footprints. They weren't mine. They were bigger, heavier, pressed deep into the dirt. They led up to the cabin, then away into the woods. The steps were uneven, like whoever left them had been dragging one foot. I followed them a few yards before they vanished into the brush. The hairs on my arms stood up. I didn't like the way they looked, like someone had been circling the cabin, waiting. That night, I locked the door again. I wedged a chair under the handle. I didn't sleep well. Every little sound outside made my heart slam against my ribs. I kept picturing someone standing just beyond the trees, watching, waiting. The next morning, I checked the footprints again. There were more. They were fresh, leading right up to my porch, right up to my door. Whoever it was had been standing there, inches from where I slept. Just standing. I felt sick. My stomach twisted into knots. There was no cell service, no way to call for help. I didn't even have a gun, just a rusted hatchet I found in the shed. I held it in my hands, gripping the worn wooden handle so tight my knuckles went white. I didn't go outside that day. I sat in the cabin with my back against the wall, facing the door. The wood stove crackled, but I didn't feel warm. I felt like the walls were closing in, like something was pressing against the outside, waiting for the right moment to push its way in. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, listening. Sometime past midnight, I heard the door handle rattle. It was slow, almost careful, like whoever was outside was testing it. I held my breath. My hands were shaking. The chair under the handle shifted slightly. A long silence. Then, footsteps on the porch. A shadow passed in front of the window. I couldn't see a face, just the shape of someone, tall and unmoving. Then, just as slowly as it came, the shadow moved away. I didn't sleep at all. At first light, I grabbed my things, stuffed everything into my bag, and left. I didn't care about the cabin, about the inheritance. I didn't stop walking until I reached my car. The tires were slashed. I nearly screamed. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the door. I still had my hatchet. I still had my keys. But I had no gas, no way out. I had to walk, miles and miles through the woods, down the dirt roads, until I reached a gas station on the edge of town. The clerk looked up at me, startled. I must have looked wild, my clothes torn, my hands scratched from the branches. I could barely get the words out. Someone's at the cabin. The police went up there, but they didn't find anything. Just my car, just my bag, just an empty cabin. They told me it was probably some drifter, someone passing through. But they didn't see the footprints. They didn't hear the door handle move in the dead of night. I never went back. I left the car, left the cabin, left everything. Some things aren't worth it. A month later, I got a call. The sheriff. He told me they found someone up near the cabin. A man. He had been living in the woods, surviving on scraps, watching. He had a knife. He had pictures of me, of the cabin, of my footprints in the dirt. The sheriff asked if I wanted to come back and collect my things. I told him to burn it all. I don't remember exactly when I started feeling uneasy about the cabin. Maybe it was the first night, maybe it was later, but it crept in slow, like the chill that seeps through old wood. The kind you don't notice at first until your bones are aching and your hands are stiff. I had rented the place for a week. A remote cabin deep in the woods, miles away from any town. It was supposed to be a break from everything, the noise, the people, the constant pressure of life. Just me, some books, and the quiet. It sounded perfect. The drive up had been longer than expected. The last stretch was nothing but a narrow dirt road that twisted through the forest, barely wide enough for my car. Trees loomed on both sides, their branches stretching overhead like fingers locking together. By the time I arrived, the sun was setting, and the temperature had dropped fast. The cabin was old but sturdy. A small wooden structure with a slanted roof, a porch with a single rocking chair, and a chimney that looked like it hadn't been used in years. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The inside was simple: a single bedroom, a kitchen, a bathroom, and a living area with a fireplace. No Wi-Fi, no TV, just a radio and a stack of old newspapers by the couch. I liked that. The first night was quiet, except for the wind outside and the occasional creak of the wooden beams settling. I read for a while by lantern light, then turned in early. I remember waking up once in the middle of the night. The room was cold, colder than it should have been. The fire had burned down to embers, and the darkness outside the window was absolute. Something felt off, but I couldn't place what. I told myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place and went back to sleep. The next morning, I explored the area around the cabin. There was a lake about a 10-minute walk away, its surface smooth and glassy. The forest stretched out endlessly in all directions, dense and untouched. I found an old shed behind the cabin, half collapsed, filled with rusted tools and broken furniture. Looked like no one had used it in decades. The second night, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't just the cold. It was a sound, a dull, rhythmic thudding, like something knocking against wood. I lay still, listening. It was coming from outside, near the porch. I got up slowly, my breath fogging in the cold air. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I moved to the window. The porch was empty, just the rocking chair shifting slightly in the wind. The knocking had stopped. I stood there for a long time, staring out into the dark. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just a loose branch tapping against the house and went back to bed. The next day, I checked around the cabin. No loose branches, nothing that could have made that sound. The air felt different, heavier. The trees seemed closer, the silence deeper. That night, I heard it again. The same steady knock. 3 beats. Pause. 3 more. It was deliberate. I didn't move. My heart pounded in my chest. I waited, barely breathing. The sound stopped after a few minutes, but sleep never came. By morning, I had decided to leave. It didn't matter if it was just my nerves or some stranger messing with me. I wasn't staying to find out. I packed quickly and went outside to load my car. That's when I saw them. Footprints in the dirt, bare feet, leading from the tree line to my porch. I froze. My stomach knotted. The prints were fresh. I forced myself to move, throwing my bags into the car, my hands shaking so bad I dropped my keys twice. I yanked the driver's side door open, jumped in, and locked the doors. The car wouldn't start. I turned the key again. Nothing, just a dull click. My breath came fast and shallow. I checked my phone. No service. I was alone, miles from anywhere, with footprints leading straight to my door. I locked the cabin and spent the day inside, knife in hand, every noise making my skin crawl. I kept checking the windows, expecting to see someone standing there, just watching. Night came too soon. The knocking started again. 3 beats. Pause. 3 more. This time it was closer, right outside the door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then the handle turned. I had locked it. I was sure I had locked it, but I heard the latch slide, slow and deliberate. I ran, bolted for the back door, out into the freezing dark. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I crashed through the trees, branches tearing at my clothes, my breath ragged. I don't know how long I ran before I saw the lights. Headlights down the road. A truck. I stumbled toward it, waving, screaming. The driver was a local, an older man who looked at me like I was crazy. I didn't care. I begged him to take me back to town. I never went back for my car. Never went back for my things. I didn't care. A week later, I checked the news. A missing persons report. A man who had stayed at that same cabin months before me. Never found. Only his car, dead by the porch, and the door swinging open in the wind. I don't know what would have happened if I had stayed. I don't want to know. I had been looking forward to the trip for months. A week in a secluded cabin, deep in the mountains. No internet, no distractions. Just me, my notebook, and the silence. It was supposed to be a break from everything: work, emails, city noise, a chance to reset. The drive took longer than expected. The roads became narrower, rougher, winding through dense forest. My phone lost service an hour before I arrived. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the trees. The place was exactly as advertised: small, old, nothing fancy. Just a single-story wooden structure with a slanted roof, a porch out front, and a stone chimney. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by thick pine trees. No neighbors, no roads in sight. Inside, it was basic. A living room with a fireplace, a tiny kitchen with outdated appliances, a single bedroom with a stiff mattress, and a bathroom that smelled faintly of mildew. It wasn't comfortable, but it would do. I set my bags down, took out the supplies I'd brought: cans of soup, coffee, bottled water, a flashlight, a hunting knife, and locked the door behind me. That first night was uneventful. I made dinner, wrote in my notebook, listened to the wind move through the trees. The silence was eerie, but I told myself I'd get used to it. Around midnight, I locked up, shut off the lantern, and went to bed. I woke up to a noise outside, a rustling, something moving in the trees. I held my breath, listening. Probably just an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe a raccoon. I turned over and forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and found something strange. Footprints. Not mine. Bare feet, human. They led from the edge of the forest to the porch, then back into the trees. My stomach tightened. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe some hiker had wandered through. Maybe I'd been too tired the night before to notice them. But the thought unsettled me. The tracks were fresh. I checked the door, still locked. Nothing inside looked disturbed. I shook it off, went about my day. By evening, I'd almost convinced myself it was nothing. But as the sun dipped behind the trees, I found myself glancing at the windows, checking the lock on the door again and again. I forced myself to eat, to read, to write, to act normal. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard it again. The rustling, closer this time. Slow, deliberate movement. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. Then, a soft sound against the porch. A creak, like someone shifting their weight on the wooden planks. I held my breath. I wanted to believe it was my imagination. But then came another sound. The doorknob, the slightest, faintest rattle. I grabbed my flashlight and the knife from my bag. I crept toward the front door, heart hammering. I stood there, listening, waiting. The rattling stopped. Silence. I flicked on the flashlight and threw the door open. Nothing. The porch was empty. The clearing was still. The trees swayed slightly in the wind, but there was no movement, no sign of anyone. But then I saw it. More footprints. New ones. leading away from the porch, disappearing into the darkness. I shut the door, locked it, shoved a chair under the knob. I barely slept. Every little sound made me jump. By morning, I had made a decision. I was leaving. I packed my bag, threw everything into the truck, turned the key. The engine sputtered, then died. I tried again. Nothing. Panic surged through me. I popped the hood, checked the battery, the fuel lines. I didn't know much about engines, but everything looked fine. But the truck wouldn't start. I was stuck. There was a town about 20 miles back. If I hiked, I could reach it by nightfall. But the thought of walking through those woods alone made my stomach twist. I decided to wait until morning, give myself daylight. I spent the day checking the cabin, looking for anything I could use. A rusty old axe in the shed, a flare gun in a drawer. I kept them close. As night fell, I sat by the fireplace, knife in my lap, listening. And then footsteps, slow, heavy, right outside the window. I didn't move. My pulse pounded in my ears. The footsteps circled the cabin. I could hear breathing, deep, measured, not an animal. And then, a knock, slow, deliberate. I didn't answer. I didn't move. Another knock, then silence. Minutes passed. An hour. I sat there, frozen. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I must have dozed off because when I opened my eyes, it was morning. I checked outside. The footprints were everywhere, circling the cabin, leading to the door, the windows. I wasn't waiting any longer. I grabbed the axe, the flare gun, my pack. I started walking, fast. Every few minutes, I glanced back, expecting to see someone following. But I didn't. I walked for hours. The forest felt endless. The sun dipped lower. My legs ached. Then finally I saw it, a road. A paved, 2-lane road. Relief crashed over me. I stepped onto the asphalt, looking for cars, for any sign of life. And that's when I saw them. Footprints, in the dirt, leading from the trees, bare feet, coming toward the road, toward me. I don't know if I'll ever be able to explain what happened out there in the woods, but I'll try. It started with a last-minute trip. My friend bailed on our weekend plans, and I didn't want to waste my time off sitting in my apartment. I found a listing for a remote cabin about 3 hours away, tucked deep into the forest. It was cheap, had good reviews, and seemed perfect for what I wanted: solitude, fresh air, and time away from the noise of the city. I left early Friday morning, taking the highway until it gave way to winding back roads. The drive was peaceful at first, but as the trees grew thicker and the road narrower, a creeping sense of unease settled over me. I chalked it up to being alone in unfamiliar territory. My cell service dropped about 20 miles from the cabin, so I relied on the printed directions I had brought with me. The cabin was exactly as the pictures had shown, small but sturdy, with a deep green roof and a wraparound porch. The key was in the lockbox, just like the owner had promised. Inside, it was basic but comfortable. A single bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living room with a wood-burning stove. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, and barely any signal. I was completely alone. I spent most of the first day hiking the nearby trails and reading on the porch. By the time the sun started setting, I was exhausted in the best way. I made dinner, lit a few candles, and settled in with a book. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and the occasional crack of a branch breaking echoed through the darkness. It was peaceful, until it wasn't. At around midnight, I woke up suddenly. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it. A slow, deliberate scraping sound, like something dragging against the porch railing. My first thought was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog. I stayed still, listening. The noise stopped, then started again, this time moving closer to the door. I sat up, heart pounding. My flashlight was on the nightstand, so I grabbed it and flicked it on. The weak beam barely reached the window. I couldn't see anything. The sound stopped. For a long time, I just sat there, listening. Nothing. I eventually convinced myself it was my imagination. Maybe the wind had blown a branch across the deck. I forced myself to lie back down, but sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the cabin made me tense up, but by dawn, exhaustion had finally won. The next morning, I found scratches on the porch railing. They weren't deep, but they were fresh, the wood lighter where it had been scraped away. I ran my fingers over them. They were too clean, too precise to be from an animal. Something someone had made them. I tried to shake off the unease. Maybe it had been a deer rubbing its antlers or something mundane. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I spent most of the day inside, occasionally glancing out the window, watching for movement. The forest seemed different now. The trees were too still, the silence too thick. The isolation, which had felt freeing the day before, now felt suffocating. That night, I locked every door and window before going to bed. I kept the flashlight in my hand, lying on top of the covers, too wired to sleep. Hours passed. Nothing happened. Then, just as I started drifting off, the noise came back. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the porch. My breath caught in my throat. I listened as whoever or whatever it was moved toward the door. Then a pause. A soft tapping at the window. I couldn't move. My brain screamed at me to do something, but my body refused. The tapping came again, this time slower, drawn out. Then silence. I don't know how long I lay there, gripping the flashlight, barely breathing. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I must have dozed off because I woke up to the morning light streaming through the windows. I checked the porch. More scratches. And footprints. Bare footprints. The logical part of me said it was a prank. Some local messing with the city guy out in the woods alone. But the deeper, more primal part of me knew better. Someone had been out there, watching, waiting. I packed my things in record time. I didn't care that I had booked the cabin for another night. I needed to leave. As I loaded my car, I felt it again, that heavy silence, that sense of being watched. I didn't look back as I drove away. When I finally got back into range, my phone exploded with missed notifications. My friends, my parents, even my boss had been trying to reach me. But there was one message that sent a chill through me. It was from the owner of the cabin. It had been sent yesterday afternoon, hours before the tapping at the window. It read, "Just saw your booking. Thought I should tell you I haven't rented that cabin out in months. If you're there, you need to leave. Now." I don't know exactly when the feeling of unease started, but I do remember the moment I realized I was truly in danger. I had rented a cabin deep in the woods, far from any town, any major road, any other people. That was the point. I needed the isolation. Life had been overwhelming, and I wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere far. I didn't want to hear the hum of traffic, the chatter of people, the constant noise of the world. Just me, the woods, and the quiet. The drive there took longer than expected. The dirt road leading to the cabin was rough, full of dips and rocks that made my old sedan groan in protest. The further I went, the more the trees pressed in, thick and tall, swallowing the sky. My phone lost signal miles before I even reached the cabin. That was expected, but it still made me hesitate. If anything happened out here, I was on my own. The cabin itself was nothing fancy. A small one-story structure, wood darkened from age and weather, a front porch with an old rocking chair, windows small and clouded from years of dust. Inside, there was a single bedroom, a tiny kitchen, a bathroom, and a living area with a couch and an old fireplace. Simple, exactly what I needed. The first night was peaceful. I lit a fire, made a simple meal, and sat in silence, just listening to the woods outside. Occasionally, I'd hear the distant hoot of an owl or the rustling of leaves as some small animal moved through the brush. The isolation was comforting. No distractions, no stress, just me and the quiet. But something changed the second night. It started with small things. I woke up in the middle of the night feeling off. Not scared, just aware of something. The kind of feeling you get when someone's watching you, even when you know you're alone. I sat up in bed, listening, but the cabin was silent. No wind, no sounds of the forest, just an empty, pressing quiet. I tried to shake it off and go back to sleep, but my body wouldn't relax. My ears strained for any sound. Nothing. And then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it. A single, deliberate footstep outside. My breath caught in my throat. I stayed completely still, listening. Nothing. Maybe it was an animal. A deer, a raccoon, something harmless. I told myself that, but I didn't move for what felt like an eternity. Eventually, I convinced myself I was overreacting and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I checked outside. The ground was soft from rain the week before, and sure enough, there were footprints near the cabin. Human footprints. They circled the cabin once and then disappeared into the woods. I tried to stay logical. Maybe a lost hiker had passed through. Maybe some local hunter had wandered too close. It was unsettling, sure, but not necessarily dangerous. Still, I locked the doors and windows before nightfall, just in case. That night, I couldn't sleep. The woods outside felt different. The normal sounds of insects and birds seemed muted, as if something was disturbing them. I stayed in bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling, listening. Every creak of the cabin made my heart pound. Then, around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps. But this time, they weren't outside. They were inside the cabin. I froze. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. The locks were still in place. The windows were shut. No one could have gotten in. But I heard them. Slow, deliberate steps moving through the living area. Then stopping. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. My body was rigid, every muscle locked. The footsteps didn't come closer, but they didn't go away either. Just standing there. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I heard them again. Moving, but not toward me, back toward the door. Then silence. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the window. The first thing I did was check the door. Still locked. Windows still shut. No signs of forced entry. But in the living room, near the fireplace, the dust on the wooden floor was disturbed. Like someone had been standing there for a long time. I should have left then. Packed up, gotten in my car, and driven away. But I told myself I was imagining things. Stress, exhaustion, and overactive mind. That was all. I stayed. The next night was worse. I kept every light on in the cabin. Kept the fire going. I refused to sleep. I sat on the couch watching the door, waiting. Hours passed. Nothing. Just silence. And then, sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. Not inside this time. Outside. Circling the cabin, slow and steady. The sound of boots on dirt. Whoever it was, they were taking their time. I grabbed the fireplace poker, the only weapon I had. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. The footsteps stopped at the front door. Then, a long, heavy silence. And then, the doorknob twisted. Not shaking, not forcing, just turning. Slowly, testing. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, the footsteps started again. Moving around the cabin toward the back. Toward the bedroom window. I ran. I don't know if I screamed, but I ran. I grabbed my car keys, yanked the door open, and sprinted to my car. The woods felt like they were closing in on me, suffocating, pressing. I didn't stop to look back. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. Headlights flooded the cabin, and for the first time I saw him, a man, standing just at the edge of the trees, dressed in dark clothing, face hidden by shadow. Watching me, I hit the gas and didn't stop. I didn't look back. I drove until I reached the nearest town, until I saw streetlights and people and the safety of civilization. I never went back to that cabin. I never even told anyone the full story. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think about that moment, the doorknob turning, the slow, careful footsteps, and I wonder how many nights he had been there before I ever noticed. I rented the cabin because I needed time away. Too much noise, too many people, too much of everything. The world felt like it was closing in and I wanted space. Real space. Somewhere off-grid, somewhere quiet. A place where I could be alone with my thoughts. I found it online. A listing that promised total seclusion, deep in the Montana woods. No neighbors, no cell service, no distractions. Just me and the trees. The photos showed a sturdy-looking cabin, a small clearing, and miles of thick forest in every direction. It was perfect. I booked it for 2 weeks, packed my truck with supplies, and drove out there. The drive took me farther from civilization than I expected. The roads turned from pavement to dirt, winding through the dense forest, the trees pressing in close. After an hour on the unpaved road, I finally spotted the cabin. It was just like the pictures, small but solid, built from thick logs, a steeply pitched roof, a wraparound porch. There was an old wooden shed about 20 yards to the side and a rusted-out truck that had clearly been sitting there for decades. I parked, got out, and stretched. The air smelled clean, fresh with pine and damp earth. It was completely silent, not even the distant hum of traffic. Just wind through the trees and the occasional chirp of a bird. I unlocked the door, stepping inside. The cabin was simple. One large main room with a wood-burning stove, a small kitchenette, and a bed in the corner. There was a bathroom, too, with an old but functioning toilet and shower. It had everything I needed. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my time chopping wood, reading, and walking through the woods. I left my phone turned off in my bag. No distractions, just me and the wilderness. At night, I sat on the porch, listening to the wind in the trees, staring up at the stars. Felt good, like I was resetting. Then, on the 4th night, I woke up suddenly. No reason, just a feeling. The kind that makes the hair on your arms stand up. I sat up in bed, listening. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows. Outside, the trees swayed in the wind, creaking softly. I didn't hear anything unusual, but something felt off. I told myself it was just the isolation messing with me. I was used to city noise, and this was a different kind of quiet. I lay back down but didn't sleep much. Every little noise seemed louder in the silence. The next day, I decided to go for a longer hike. I followed a game trail that wound through the trees, taking my time, listening to the crunch of leaves under my boots. After about 2 hours, I spotted something strange. A tree with deep gouges in the bark, long and parallel, too wide for an animal like a bear, too clean. I ran my fingers over them. They looked fresh. I kept going but felt uneasy. The deeper I went, the more signs I saw. Trees stripped of bark, the undergrowth disturbed, patches of flattened grass like something large had passed through. After another hour, I turned back. The forest felt different, heavier. I kept checking over my shoulder, feeling watched. That night, I locked the door, something I hadn't done before. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was just nature, just the wild being wild. I forced myself to sleep. Sometime in the night, I woke up again. This time, there was a sound, a soft, deliberate crunch of leaves outside the cabin. Slow, careful. I held my breath, listening. Another step, then another. Not an animal. Too precise, too steady. I slid out of bed, moving as quietly as I could. The fire had burned low again, the room dim. I reached for the flashlight by the bed, clicking it on. Silence. I walked to the window, angling the beam outside. The trees swayed, the ground dappled in shadows. Nothing moved. I stood there for a long time before finally getting back in bed, though I didn't sleep. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. Nothing, just leaves, twigs, and the same untouched wilderness. I checked the shed, finding only old tools and a stack of firewood. I told myself it had been my imagination. Still, I started keeping my axe inside at night. 2 nights later, it happened again. This time, it was louder, closer, more distinct. Footsteps, stopping just outside the cabin walls. I gripped the axe, heart pounding, then scraping, along the wood, like fingers dragging over the logs. I wanted to call out, to scare whoever it was away, but something stopped me. A deep gut feeling. Whoever was out there didn't scare easy. I sat in the dark, gripping the axe, listening. After what felt like an eternity, the sound stopped. I didn't sleep at all. The first light, I made a decision. I was leaving. I packed my gear, shoving everything into my bag. I went outside to load my truck and froze. All around the cabin, in the dirt and leaves, were footprints. Human footprints. There. They circled the cabin, stopping at the windows, the door, the shed. I threw my gear in the truck and got inside, locking the doors. The engine roared to life, and I slammed it into reverse, kicking up dirt as I sped down the path. I didn't stop, not until I was miles away, back on paved roads, back where I could get service. I pulled over and called the owner, breathless. I told him someone had been around the cabin at night, that I had proof. He was quiet for a long moment before sighing. "You're not the first to say that," he admitted. "But every time I check, there's nothing there." I didn't argue. I didn't care. I just kept driving. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't want to know. I just know I'll never go back. I never should have gone up there alone. I told myself that over and over as I stared at the locked door, my fingers trembling as I gripped the old hunting knife I had found in one of the kitchen drawers. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the wooden walls of the cabin like some unseen force was testing their strength. The trees swayed violently in the dark, casting shifting shadows through the window. My breath came in short, ragged bursts as I tried to calm myself. But I knew I wasn't alone anymore. I had come to this cabin deep in the Montana woods to get away. Life had been weighing on me. Work, relationships, the constant noise of the city pressing in from all sides. A friend of mine had a cousin who owned the place, an old hunting lodge that hadn't been used in years. Off-grid, he had told me. No cell service, no internet, nothing but peace and quiet. That was exactly what I had wanted. Just a week to clear my head, to be by myself, to breathe. The first day had been peaceful. The cabin was dusty but well kept, a single-story structure with a small living area, a kitchen, a bedroom, and a bathroom. There was no electricity, just a wood-burning stove and an old gas-powered lantern I found under the sink. The well outside provided fresh water, and I had brought enough food to last. It was simple, it was perfect, but by the second night, something felt wrong. I woke up around 3 in the morning, my mouth dry, needing a drink. The cabin was silent except for the occasional creak of the wooden walls settling. I reached for the lantern and lit it, the soft glow pushing back the darkness just enough for me to navigate to the kitchen. As I poured myself a glass of water, I noticed something strange. The front door was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it before bed. I always did. But there it was, the latch hanging loose, the wood slightly ajar. A cold breeze drifted in from outside. My stomach twisted, but I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe I had forgotten. Maybe the old door didn't close properly. I locked it again, double-checking this time, and went back to bed. The next morning, I found something even stranger. Footprints in the dirt just outside the cabin. Not mine. These were different, larger, heavier, and deep, like someone had been standing there for a long time. I stared at them for a long moment, my skin crawling. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. The nearest town was miles away, and as far as I knew, there were no other cabins nearby. Still, I tried to push the thought away. Maybe an old hunter had wandered through. Maybe it was just my nerves playing tricks on me. By the 4th night, I knew I wasn't imagining things. I had barricaded the door with a chair, just in case, and gone to bed early. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound, a soft scraping, like something being dragged across wood. I held my breath, listening. Then I heard it again, a slow, deliberate movement right outside the cabin. I stayed frozen in bed, every muscle in my body tense. My mind raced. An animal? No, this was different. Too steady, too intentional. I reached for the knife I had brought with me and crept toward the window, careful not to make a sound. I pulled the curtain back just a sliver. The porch was empty, but the chair I had wedged against the door was gone. I knew then that someone was out there, watching me. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping the knife in my hands, my ears straining for any movement. The sounds didn't come back, but I felt something in the air, a weight pressing down on me. Whoever it was, they weren't finished. I made up my mind to leave at first light. But when dawn came, my truck wouldn't start. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood, but I wasn't a mechanic. All I could see was that something had been tampered with. The battery cables were loose. I tightened them with shaking hands, my breath coming fast. Took 3 tries before the engine finally roared to life. I didn't even go back inside to grab my things. I didn't care about the food, the clothes, or anything else I had left in the cabin. I slammed the door shut and tore down that dirt road as fast as I could, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. My heart pounded as I checked the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me leave. I didn't stop until I hit the main road, miles away from the cabin. Only then did I pull over, my whole body shaking. I sat there for a long time, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had happened. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I know one thing. They wanted me to stay. I never should have gone up there alone. I told myself that over and over as I stared at the locked door, my fingers trembling as I gripped the old hunting knife I had found in one of the kitchen drawers. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the wooden walls of the cabin like some unseen force was testing their strength. The trees swayed violently in the dark, casting shifting shadows through the window. My breath came in short, ragged bursts as I tried to calm myself. But I knew I wasn't alone anymore. I had come to this cabin deep in the Montana woods to get away. Life had been weighing on me. Work, relationships, the constant noise of the city pressing in from all sides. A friend of mine had a cousin who owned the place, an old hunting lodge that hadn't been used in years. Off-grid, he had told me. No cell service, no internet, nothing but peace and quiet. That was exactly what I had wanted. Just a week to clear my head, to be by myself, to breathe. The first day had been peaceful. The cabin was dusty but well kept, a single-story structure with a small living area, a kitchen, a bedroom, and a bathroom. There was no electricity, just a wood-burning stove and an old gas-powered lantern I found under the sink. The well outside provided fresh water, and I had brought enough food to last. It was simple, it was perfect, but by the second night, something felt wrong. I woke up around 3 in the morning, my mouth dry, needing a drink. The cabin was silent except for the occasional creak of the wooden walls settling. I reached for the lantern and lit it, the soft glow pushing back the darkness just enough for me to navigate to the kitchen. As I poured myself a glass of water, I noticed something strange. The front door was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it before bed. I always did. But there it was, the latch hanging loose, the wood slightly ajar. A cold breeze drifted in from outside. My stomach twisted, but I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe I had forgotten. Maybe the old door didn't close properly. I locked it again, double-checking this time, and went back to bed. The next morning, I found something even stranger. Footprints in the dirt just outside the cabin. Not mine. These were different, larger, heavier, and deep, like someone had been standing there for a long time. I stared at them for a long moment, my skin crawling. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. The nearest town was miles away, and as far as I knew, there were no other cabins nearby. Still, I tried to push the thought away. Maybe an old hunter had wandered through. Maybe it was just my nerves playing tricks on me. By the 4th night, I knew I wasn't imagining things. I had barricaded the door with a chair, just in case, and gone to bed early. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound, a soft scraping, like something being dragged across wood. I held my breath, listening. Then I heard it again, a slow, deliberate movement right outside the cabin. I stayed frozen in bed, every muscle in my body tense. My mind raced. An animal? No, this was different. Too steady, too intentional. I reached for the knife I had brought with me and crept toward the window, careful not to make a sound. I pulled the curtain back just a sliver. The porch was empty, but the chair I had wedged against the door was gone. I knew then that someone was out there, watching me. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping the knife in my hands, my ears straining for any movement. The The sounds didn't come back, but I felt something in the air, a weight pressing down on me. Whoever it was, they weren't finished. I made up my mind to leave at first light, but when dawn came, my truck wouldn't start. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood, but I wasn't a mechanic. All I could see was that something had been tampered with. The battery cables were loose. I tightened them with shaking hands, my breath coming fast. Took 3 tries before the engine finally roared to life. I didn't even go back inside to grab my things. I didn't care about the food, the clothes, or anything else I had left in the cabin. I slammed the door shut and tore down that dirt road as fast as I could, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. My heart pounded as I checked the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me leave. I didn't stop until I hit the main road, miles away from the cabin. Only then did I pull over, my whole body shaking. I sat there for a long time, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had happened. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted, but I know one thing. They wanted me to stay. I never should have gone up there alone. I told myself that over and over as I stared at the locked door, my fingers trembling as I gripped the old hunting knife I had found in one of the kitchen drawers. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the wooden walls of the cabin like some unseen force was testing their strength. The trees swayed violently in the dark, casting shifting shadows through the window. My breath came in short, ragged bursts as I tried to calm myself. But I knew I wasn't alone anymore. I had come to this cabin deep in the Montana woods to get away. Life had been weighing on me. Work, relationships, the constant noise of the city pressing in from all sides. A friend of mine had a cousin who owned the place, an old hunting lodge that hadn't been used in years. Off-grid, he had told me. No cell service, no internet, nothing but peace and quiet. That was exactly what I had wanted. Just a week to clear my head, to be by myself, to breathe. The first day had been peaceful. The cabin was dusty but well kept, a single-story structure with a small living area, a kitchen, a bedroom, and a bathroom. There was no electricity, just a wood-burning stove and an old gas-powered lantern I found under the sink. The well outside provided fresh water, and I had brought enough food to last. It was simple, it was perfect, but by the second night, something felt wrong. I woke up around 3 in the morning, my mouth dry, needing a drink. The cabin was silent except for the occasional creak of the wooden walls settling. I reached for the lantern and lit it, the soft glow pushing back the darkness just enough for me to navigate to the kitchen. As I poured myself a glass of water, I noticed something strange. The front door was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it before bed. I always did. But there it was, the latch hanging loose, the wood slightly ajar. A cold breeze drifted in from outside. My stomach twisted, but I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe I had forgotten. Maybe the old door didn't close properly. I locked it again, double-checking this time, and went back to bed. The next morning, I found something even stranger. Footprints in the dirt just outside the cabin. Not mine. These were different, larger, heavier, and deep, like someone had been standing there for a long time. I stared at them for a long moment, my skin crawling. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. The nearest town was miles away, and as far as I knew, there were no other cabins nearby. Still, I tried to push the thought away. Maybe an old hunter had wandered through. Maybe it was just my nerves playing tricks on me. By the 4th night, I knew I wasn't imagining things. I had barricaded the door with a chair, just in case, and gone to bed early. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound, a soft scraping, like something being dragged across wood. I held my breath, listening. Then I heard it again, a slow, deliberate movement right outside the cabin. I stayed frozen in bed, every muscle in my body tense. My mind raced. An animal? No, this was different. Too steady, too intentional. I reached for the knife I had brought with me and crept toward the window, careful not to make a sound. I pulled the curtain back just a sliver. The porch was empty, but the chair I had wedged against the door was gone. I knew then that someone was out there, watching me. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping the knife in my hands, my ears straining for any movement. The sounds didn't come back, but I felt something in the air, a weight pressing down on me. Whoever it was, they weren't finished. I made up my mind to leave at first light, but when dawn came, my truck wouldn't start. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood, but I wasn't a mechanic. All I could see was that something had been tampered with. The battery cables were loose. I tightened them with shaking hands, my breath coming fast. Took 3 tries before the engine finally roared to life. I didn't even go back inside to grab my things. I didn't care about the food, the clothes, or anything else I had left in the cabin. I slammed the door shut and tore down that dirt road as fast as I could, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. My heart pounded as I checked the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me leave. I didn't stop until I hit the main road, miles away from the cabin. Only then did I pull over, my whole body shaking. I sat there for a long time, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had happened. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted, but I know one thing. They wanted me to stay. I don't know why I decided to spend a week alone in a cabin. Maybe I just wanted to get away from everything. City noise, people, routine. Felt like a good idea at the time. A break, a reset. I had rented this place online, deep in the woods of northern Montana, far from any town. The listing had described it as secluded, peaceful, and perfect for disconnecting. That's exactly what I wanted. The drive out there was long. The last 30 miles were on an old logging road, winding through dense trees. My phone lost service about halfway in. That was expected, but it still made me uneasy. It felt like crossing some invisible barrier, leaving behind everything familiar. I kept driving until I saw the cabin, a small, simple structure with a pitched roof and a wraparound porch. There was a shed a few yards away and nothing else but thick forest in every direction. Inside, the cabin was basic. A single open space with a small kitchen, a wood-burning stove, a bed in the corner, and a tiny bathroom. No electricity, just propane lanterns. The air smelled like pine and old wood. It was quiet, too quiet. That kind of silence you only get in deep wilderness, where no cars, no voices, no hum of distant city life exist. Just wind through the trees, the occasional creak of the wooden walls settling. I unpacked, made a simple dinner, and sat on the porch as the sun went down. The sky turned deep orange, then purple. The trees became nothing but dark shapes. The first night, I slept fine. The second night, I started hearing things. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just little sounds outside, maybe an animal moving through the brush. But as the hours passed, the noises became stranger. A shuffling sound near the shed, a soft thump on the porch. I told myself it was nothing, but then I heard footsteps, not the light, quick steps of an animal. These were slow, heavy, careful. I held my breath, listening. The steps circled the cabin, one slow, deliberate step at a time. I lay frozen in bed, gripping the blanket. There was no lock on the cabin door, just an old latch. I wished I had thought about that earlier. My heart pounded in my chest. I strained my ears. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then, after what felt like forever, I heard them again, moving away this time, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I went outside, pretending I wasn't scared. I checked around the cabin, looking for footprints in the dirt. Nothing. No signs of anyone or anything. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe the woods were playing tricks on me. I tried to shake it off, spent the day hiking, chopping some firewood, keeping busy. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, the noises came back. Louder, closer, a scraping sound on the walls, something tapping against the window. My stomach knotted. I sat up in bed, staring into the darkness. Then I heard it, the doorknob rattling. Slowly, softly, I grabbed the only weapon I had, an old hunting knife I found in the cabin's kitchen. I held it tight, barely breathing. The rattling stopped. More silence. Then, a single knock. Not a loud, urgent knock. Just one deliberate tap. Then another. And another. I wanted to run. But where? There was nothing but miles of forest in every direction. My truck was parked just outside, but the keys were across the room on the counter. To get them, I'd have to pass right by the door. I stayed frozen. The knocking continued for what felt like forever. Then, finally, it stopped. Morning came, and I barely had the courage to open the door. Again, no signs of anything. No footprints. No marks. Nothing. But I knew what I heard. I decided I had enough. I packed my bag, ready to leave. As I grabbed my keys, I glanced at the door, and my stomach dropped. The latch was undone. I know I locked it the night before. I was sure of it. Someone had been inside. I didn't pack the rest of my things. I didn't care. I grabbed my keys, ran to my truck, and turned the engine over. Gravel kicked up as I sped down the dirt road, glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds. The cabin disappeared behind the trees. I didn't stop driving for hours. When I finally got back to town, I went straight to a gas station, parked under the bright lights, and just sat there, trying to catch my breath. I checked my phone, still no service. Then I noticed something. My backpack, the one I always kept in the passenger seat, was open. I didn't remember opening it. I leaned over, looked inside, and felt my skin go cold. Inside was a single crumpled piece of paper. Scrawled in shaky handwriting were 3 words. "You were lucky. I never went back." I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A week alone in a rented cabin, deep in the woods, away from work, from the city, from people. No emails, no calls, just me, the trees, and the quiet. I wanted that kind of silence that you don't get anywhere else. The kind where you can hear your own heartbeat, where the only sounds are the wind and the rustling of branches. That kind of silence where you can finally hear yourself think. The drive was long, nearly 6 hours from home, the last 2 hours spent on winding dirt roads that weren't even on Google Maps. My phone signal had dropped about 30 minutes before I reached the cabin, and I knew it wouldn't be coming back anytime soon. That was part of the plan. No distractions, just peace. The cabin itself was exactly as described. Small but sturdy, nestled between tall trees, far enough from any neighboring property that I couldn't see another house in any direction. It had the basics: a bedroom, a small living area, a kitchen with an old but functional stove, and a bathroom. No Wi-Fi, obviously. The owner had left the key under a loose rock by the front steps, just like his email had said. By the time I finished unloading my bags and getting settled, the sun was starting to dip below the trees. The first night went exactly as I had hoped. I cooked a simple meal on the gas stove, read a few chapters of a book, and then sat on the porch listening to the wind move through the trees. It was cold, colder than I expected for late October, and the air smelled like damp earth and pine. I slept better that night than I had in months. The second day was uneventful. I spent most of it hiking a few of the trails that stretched out behind the cabin, following a narrow path that led me deeper into the forest. The ground was uneven, the terrain rougher than I thought it would be. I nearly twisted my ankle more than once on loose rocks hidden under layers of fallen leaves. But it felt good to be out there, away from everything. That night, things started to feel off. I was sitting on the porch again, wrapped in a blanket, staring out into the darkness. There was no light out there, not even a sliver of moon, just pitch black woods stretching endlessly in all directions. And then, just as I was about to go back inside, I heard something. Not an animal, not the wind, something else. It was distant, just on the edge of hearing. A sound like footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere deep in the woods. I sat there, holding my breath, waiting, listening. The sound stopped. I told myself it was nothing, my mind playing tricks on me. I went inside, locked the door, and went to bed. The next day, I found something strange about 100 feet from the cabin. A single boot, half buried in the dirt. Old, cracked leather. a size much bigger than mine. It looked like it had been there a long time, but something about it didn't sit right with me. I walked back to the cabin, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. That night, I heard the footsteps again, closer. I turned off all the lights and stood by the window, staring out into the trees. Nothing, just darkness. I barely slept. Every sound made me sit up, heart pounding. By the time the sun came up, I decided I'd had enough. I packed my things, locked up the cabin, and got in my car. I wasn't going to stay another night. The car wouldn't start. The engine turned over, but it wouldn't catch. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood, checked what little I knew to check, but I couldn't see anything wrong. My stomach dropped. I was stranded. I spent the day trying to get a signal on my phone, walking in different directions, holding it up, turning it off and on. Nothing. Not a single bar. I went back inside and tried to stay calm. That night, the footsteps came again. Closer. This time, I didn't just hear them. I saw movement between the trees. A figure just beyond the reach of the porch light. Not an animal. Person. Watching. I grabbed the knife from the kitchen, heart hammering. I didn't move. Didn't blink. Just stared into the trees, waiting. The figure didn't come closer. Didn't leave. Just stood there, barely visible in the dark. And then, after what felt like hours, it disappeared. I didn't sleep. I sat in the corner of the cabin, knife in hand, waiting for morning. As soon as it was light, I tried the car again. It started. Just like that, like nothing had ever been wrong. I didn't question it. I just drove. Fast. I didn't stop until I was back on the main road, until I saw another car, until I had service again. When I finally pulled over, hands shaking, I checked my phone. No missed calls. No messages. Just a weather alert, dated 2 nights before. Severe storm warning. Travel not advised. That was the night I heard the first footsteps. I don't know who or what was out there in the woods. I don't want to know. I'll never go back to that cabin again. I had been looking forward to the solitude. A week alone in a remote cabin. Just me, the woods, and the quiet. No distractions, no responsibilities. Just time to reset. The place was about 5 miles from the nearest paved road, deep in a national forest. My only access was a dirt path barely wide enough for my truck, overgrown with roots and lined with thick trees that seemed to press inward the farther I went. The cabin itself was old but sturdy, built decades ago and barely maintained. It had no electricity, no running water, just a wood-burning stove, a cot, and a rain barrel outside. The guy I rented it from said it used to be a hunting lodge, but now it was mostly a retreat for people who wanted to disappear for a while. That sounded perfect to me. The first day was fine. I settled in, chopped some wood, made a fire, and cooked a can of soup over the stove. The quiet was almost overwhelming, but I liked it. At night, the forest came alive with sounds. Branches creaking, leaves rustling, the occasional animal call. I wasn't scared. Not yet. It started the second night. I woke up to a sound I couldn't place. Not an animal, not the wind, something deliberate. A scraping noise, slow and rhythmic, like metal dragging against wood. I sat up, listening hard. Came from outside, near the porch. My heart pounded, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a tree branch had fallen and was shifting in the wind. Morning came and I went outside to check. The ground was covered in damp leaves, and my footprints from the day before were still visible. But near the porch, something else. Drag marks, long, thin grooves in the dirt, running parallel to the steps, like something heavy had been pulled along. I looked around, but there was nothing that could have caused them. No fallen branches, no loose pieces of metal. Just those marks, leading from the tree line to my porch and then stopping. I tried to shake it off. Maybe an animal had dragged something there, a deer carcass or some piece of trash from an old campsite. But it didn't sit right with me. I spent the rest of the day trying to distract myself. Hiking a little, gathering firewood, anything to keep my mind from wandering back to those marks. That night, I barely slept. Every noise outside made me sit up, Every creak in the cabin made my skin prickle. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard it again. The scraping, slow, deliberate, right outside the walls. I held my breath, gripping my flashlight, my ears straining. The sound circled the cabin, moving from one side to the other. I wanted to look outside, but I couldn't make myself do it. Instead, I sat in the dark, waiting. At some point, the noise stopped. I must have drifted off because I woke up to daylight, still gripping my flashlight. I stepped outside, bracing myself. More marks, deeper this time, leading from the trees right up to my door. And next to them, footprints. Human footprints. Bare feet, deep in the mud, circling the cabin before disappearing back into the woods. I couldn't explain it away anymore. Someone had been out there watching me, maybe trying to get in. My stomach twisted at the thought. I grabbed my keys and decided to leave. I wasn't going to stick around and find out who or what was creeping around my cabin at night. I packed up in record time, stuffing my gear into my truck, throwing the last of my supplies in the back. But when I went to start it, the engine wouldn't turn over. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood, checking the battery, the cables, everything looked fine. But the truck was dead. Panic started to set in. I had no cell service, no way to call for help, and no one was expecting me back for another 5 days. My only option was to hike back to the main road and hope I ran into someone. But 5 miles through dense forest, alone with whatever was out there watching me. I didn't like my odds. I spent the rest of the day trying to come up with a plan. I could stay in the cabin, barricade the doors, wait it out. But what if whoever was out there came back? What if they got in? The thought made my skin crawl. As night fell, I locked every door, every window, shoving furniture against the entrances. I kept my flashlight and a hunting knife close, listening, waiting. The night stretched on, every minute dragging. Then, around 2 a.m., the scraping started again. Louder this time, closer. I held my breath, gripping my knife so tight my knuckles ached. The sound circled the cabin, then stopped right outside the door. Silence. Then, a soft, deliberate knock. 3 slow, heavy taps. I didn't move, didn't breathe. My mind screamed at me to do something, but I couldn't. I just sat there, frozen, staring at the door. The knock came again. 3 slow, heavy taps. Then silence. I don't know how long I sat there before I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, retreating into the woods. I stayed awake until dawn, barely breathing. When the first light crept through the trees, I unblocked the door and stepped outside. The marks were there again, deeper than before. And in the dirt, just outside my door, a single word had been etched with a sharp object. Run. I ran. I didn't care about my gear, my truck. I just ran. Through the woods, down the trail, as fast as my legs would carry me. I didn't stop, didn't look back. Not even when I thought I heard something moving behind me. It took me hours, but I finally reached the main road. A truck passed by not long after, and I flagged it down. The driver took one look at me, sweat-soaked, wide-eyed, shaking, and didn't ask questions. Just drove me to the nearest town. I reported what happened to the local authorities, but they didn't seem too interested. Said it was probably a squatter, maybe a drifter passing through. But I knew better. I never went back for my truck. Never went back to that cabin. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't want to know. All I know is that I left just in time, and that whatever was out there watching me in the dark didn't want me to leave at all. I never should have gone up to that cabin alone. It was meant to be a break, a quiet getaway from the noise of the city, but it turned into something I can't forget. The place belonged to an old friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. When I mentioned needing a place to clear my head, he offered me his family's cabin deep in the mountains, about a 4-hour drive from where I lived. He told me it was isolated, no neighbors for miles, and that cell service was unreliable. That was fine by me. I wanted solitude. I left early in the morning, my car packed with supplies. The drive was peaceful at first, long stretches of road cutting through dense forest. As I got deeper into the mountains, the roads became narrower and the trees seemed taller, pressing in on either side. There were no streetlights, no signs of other cars. Just me, the winding road, and the occasional deer darting across. By the time I reached the turnoff, the sun was starting to dip behind the treetops. The dirt road leading to the cabin was rough, barely wide enough for my car. It twisted through the woods for what felt like forever until I finally saw the cabin. It was old but sturdy looking, built from thick logs with a steep roof and a wraparound porch. A small clearing surrounded it, the forest thick and dark just beyond. A shed stood off to the side, its door slightly ajar. I killed the engine and stepped out. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. It was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. No cars, no distant hum of civilization, just silence. Inside, the cabin was simple. A single room with a fireplace, a kitchen area, a small bathroom, and a loft with a bed. Dust covered most surfaces, but everything seemed in decent shape. I set my bags down and started a fire in the wood stove. The light flickered against the walls, casting long shadows. That first night, I sat by the fire, listening to the sounds of the forest, the occasional rustling in the trees, the creak of the wooden porch as the wind shifted. I told myself it was peaceful, that I had needed this. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard something outside, a crunch of leaves, slow, deliberate footsteps. I froze, listening. Another crunch, then nothing. Could have been an animal, a deer maybe, but something about it felt off. I waited, heart pounding, but the footsteps didn't return. The next morning, I walked around the cabin, looking for signs of anything unusual. There were no tracks, no disturbances in the dirt. Maybe I had imagined it. The day passed quietly. I chopped some wood, read a book, took a short hike through the trees. By evening, I almost felt relaxed. Then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, I saw it. Across the clearing at the tree line, something stood there. A figure. It was far enough away that I couldn't make out details, but it was unmistakably human. They weren't moving, just standing there, facing the cabin. I stared, my stomach tightening. "Hello," I called, my voice sounding small in the open air. No response, no movement. I took a step toward the porch railing, trying to get a better look. The figure remained still. I felt exposed, standing there in the open, so I backed toward the door. The moment I moved, the figure took a step back into the trees. Then another. Then it was gone. I locked the door. I told myself it was probably just a hiker, maybe a hunter, someone who hadn't expected to see a cabin occupied. But deep down, I didn't believe that. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin made my heart jump. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time. Then, the sound of something brushing against the side of the cabin. I held my breath. The sound moved, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. I reached for the flashlight beside my bed, gripping it so tightly my knuckles ached. The footsteps stopped near the front door. I waited, barely breathing. Then the doorknob rattled. I sat up fast, heart slamming against my ribs. The knob twisted once, twice, then silence. I didn't move for the rest of the night. I just sat there, staring at the door, waiting. Morning took forever to come. As soon as the sun was up, I packed my things. I had planned to stay a week. I wasn't staying another night. But when I stepped outside, something stopped me cold. Footprints, leading from the woods to my door. Bare footprints. The drive back was a blur. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. The relief I felt when I hit the main road was overwhelming. I never told my friend exactly what happened, just that I had to leave early. He didn't ask questions. I still think about that night, about the figure at the tree line, the sound of footsteps circling the cabin, the bare footprints in the dirt. I don't know who or what was out there, and I never want to find out.